All right. And you can find the rest of the webinars in the Woodland Stewards series, which includes previous year's webinars dating back to 2019 on the forestry webinar portal. And please note that as taxes are coming up, that there's a great timber tax webinar series, which is relevant to anyone who owns some chunk of land. After the webinar, you're going to want to return to the screen where you first joined the webinar and press complete the webinar, which will help you reach the evaluation and give us some feedback on this presentation, as well as receive a certificate of participation and or continuing education credits. So if you want your continuing education credits, it's pretty important that you do go back to the screen. And lastly, the Woodland Stewards webinar series program was created by a team of extension professionals from a ton of different programs across the South and beyond, who've worked together to create a topic for each season and then find presenters and flesh out those presentations. As we go through this presentation, I just want to ask that you try to post your questions in the Q&A. So you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there'll be a little button that says Q&A. So you can post that there and it's easier for us to keep track. We will do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. So let's see. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you, Brett. And Ashley, would you like to do some introductions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So welcome everybody again. This is the third webinar in our silvopasture series, I believe, if I'm doing my math right. We're happy to welcome back Brett Chedzoy. Brett is a senior resource educator in agriculture and natural resources with Cornell Extension. And he's coming to us from New York, over 30 years of professional experience in forestry and farming. And we're going to kick off with him, giving a little bit of information about hardwood silvopasturing. And then afterwards, we'll switch over to Wynn Miller. She's the agroforester expert in silvopasturist of Lick Skillet Farms in Tennessee. So we're looking forward to hearing from both of these folks and hopefully answering some more questions for y'all. Take it away, Brett.
And the slides look good, so you're all good, Brett.
And it would help if I unmute. Thank you, Ashley. So in planning this series, we went back and forth on whether to have a separate session about putting trees into pasture or lump all the softwoods into one week's webinar and hardwoods into another. And so we ended up, I think, settling on this strategy of talking about softwood silvopastures last week, and this week we'll focus more on hardwoods. But regardless of whether we're talking whatever the mix of trees, I think a lot of the principles that were discussed in week one by John and Ashley remain the same. Today I'm going to put on my extension forester hat, but share experiences largely from our own farm here in upstate New York. We're a 500-acre grazing operation that raises, we're a cow-calf operation, certified grass-fed herd, and we extensively use silvopastures on our farm, both here in New York. And if you were watching the week one webinar, I also mentioned that we have a ranching operation in central Argentina, which is where my wife Maria is from, and there it's all silvopasture as well. So, but it's mostly softwood silvopastures there in central Argentina, southern yellow pine species. Today I'm going to be talking more about hardwoods, and regardless of whether you're in the deep south or here in the far north, I think that there's a lot of common hardwood species that we can be thinking of as useful for silvopastures. Wynn is probably going to get into some of the tree species that they've planted in Tennessee and why they chose those species. But species like sycamore and black locust and honey locust and oaks and tulip and poplars or aspen, those maybe well, the species would be largely the same whether we're in New York or pretty well into the deep southeast. So, all right, get on the right slide here. Today, we're going to talk about both of these opportunities for creating hardwood silvopastures, whether it's putting trees into our open grazing environments or putting forages into an existing wooded area. But regardless of which of these two directions we're coming from, we're striving to reach that happy place in the middle where the forages, the livestock, and the trees are all working together in a synergistic and symbiotic fashion. I'm going to let Wynn cover much of the putting trees into pasture to direction today, since that's a big part of what they've been doing on their farm. On our farm in New York, we've done both. But before we continue on to talk about the challenges and opportunities of doing these, I'm going to split silvopastures, or hardwood silvopastures in particular, into some further categories. I believe in the week one overview, Ashley used the terms. I don't think there's any official terms, so we all kind of use terms that mean something to us, but plantation or planted silvopastures versus woodland silvopastures, sometimes also referred to as thin silvopastures. So we still have to thin our plantation silvopastures, meaning either the trees were already there, or it's a grazing environment where there's opportunities to add trees. And when we broaden the picture into hardwoods, we can be thinking of plantation silvopastures, uh, wood silvopastures, or farm woodlot silvopastures, orchard silvopastures, which is a category of silvopastures that's often overlooked. I had the opportunity to spend some time up in Ontario, Canada a few years ago, and they're really going all in with orchard silvopasturing. These are very large commercial orchards, and they're using them very strategically to support both their livestock, flocks and herds, as well as to manage their orchards better. And then one that I think kind of crosses over between the plantation and the woodlot, and that is, I'm just going to call it reclaimed silvopastures here in the Northeast, but probably throughout the entire eastern US. We have a lot of formerly agricultural land that is, in more recent decades, with increasing deer browsing impacts, has imperfectly reverted to, I often think of them as invasive shrublands, but they may be a mix of shrubs as well as trees. And almost every farm landscape up here in upstate New York has an abundance of these types of acreages, and it wasn't land that was quite good enough to crop. The livestock may have left the area, so it was no longer grazed, and maybe was a little too springy or rocky or steep, or not productive enough to keep in some other sort of agricultural production. But we have kind of a whole spectrum of these situations where it may be more woody shrubs versus trees, but perhaps not exactly the sort of high stocked, high quality, high value hardwood type stands that you would think of as like the origin of a silvopasture that you see in the lower left-hand corner of the woodlot picture there. So it doesn't matter, labels aside, just we have a lot of situations where we can be both enhancing treeless grazing landscapes by incorporating more trees, or we have the trees or some sort of useful woody plants already there that we can then be incorporating the forages into to create a productive grazing system that's I think good for our livestock and good for our bottom line and good for our communities that we live in. Is Colby and Buren were presenting last week about let's just call them pine silvopastures, but softwood or coniferous silvopastures. I started making a list of some of the obvious differences that come to mind if, between hardwoods and softwoods. And these are generalities, so I think we can all think of a exception here, but on average, hardwoods have a higher value per tree and consequently maybe a higher overall value across the entire stand or on a per acre basis. Hardwoods, and this is not entirely untrue of softwoods, but hardwoods, in addition to their timber value, they can also provide additional food sources for livestock, or at least some types of livestock, such as browse and mass production. There's often when we plant hardwoods, we're thinking about planting more of a mixed species planting. Many hardwood species can grow well together, compatible in their growth patterns. That may not be true if you're thinking of more intensified planting like loblolly pine or longleaf pine. Not that you couldn't plant multiple pine species together, they just may be not well suited for co-management. And some hardwoods species or families, such as the legumes, black locust, honey locust, as well as some species from the birch family, like alders, have nitrogen fixing ability, which can be beneficial to the forages and improving the productivity of the land over time. On the downside, hardwoods almost always cost more to establish than softwoods, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is they're more vulnerable to browsing, not just by our livestock, but by other wildlife, particularly white-tailed deer. And hardwoods are also, on average, more susceptible to herbaceous competition. And so growing them in a sod environment that's full of herbivores and want to eat them, you're going to invest a lot of money in protection. And Wynn's going to share some really innovative ways that they've protected their young trees in their pasture environments. If you have your livestock damage, either whether it's girdling or perhaps some other sort of mechanical damage to a softwood tree, not that softwoods are of low value, but the opportunity cost of that damage is probably quite a bit less than if it's a high value hardwood tree. A typical good quality oak tree or maple tree or cherry tree, walnut, even much higher in our neighborhood, a single tree can be worth hundreds of dollars. So if your animals inadvertently kill that tree through mismanagement and turn it into basically firewood, that's a large economic loss. Hardwoods overall tend to be more sensitive to site quality. There are some exceptions to that, but better sites are better suited for growing better quality hardwoods. Not that softwoods won't do well on better sites as well. And finally, if you think about how a hardwood tree grows, kind of like a inverted cone versus a softwood tree that, well, not an inverted cone. A softwood grows like a inverted cone, and a hardwood grows like a upright cone, meaning the hardwoods want to put out a big crown, lots of branches, and if you don't plant initially at a very high density, which is probably not cost effective, you're going to have to compensate by going in and doing some corrective pruning, as well as just pruning of the lower limbs to promote stem quality. And Colby did talk a little bit about pruning in softwoods last week. So it's not that you wouldn't necessarily be safe from doing pruning in softwood silvopastures. In Argentina, we plant mostly slash pine, which tends to self-prune, but if we were planting loblolly pine, we would have to do more pruning of the lower limbs to maintain sunlight reaching the ground surface to grow productive forages. As an example of the fodder value of hardwoods, honey locust is a classic example. This is a dated study, but hasn't changed over time. If anything, these values have improved as people that are planting honey locusts into pasture systems use improved cultivars like the Hershey honey locust. But the message I want you to take away from this slide here is that the value of that mast, the feed value of that mast can be quite high. So we have all the benefits of having the shade and the timber and the other ecosystem services that the trees provide, but they can also be importing a important source of nutrition for livestock, particularly at times of the year when the forages may be waning. Just two more slides related to tree planting, and then we're going to shift over to what we tend to do more of here in the Northeast, which is the woodlot silvopasturing. But I am going to get on my soapbox for a moment in case Wynn doesn't emphasize these points. If you're going to plant trees, that first bullet, that's stating the obvious, pick trees that are going to meet your objectives. For silvopastures, we're often thinking of multiple objectives, from shade to timber to possibly those other things like mass production, but also thinking about some of the less tangible values that we can get out of those trees, not least of which is great habitat for our wildlife. I have learned the hard way over the past 35 years of my own tree planting experiences, spend a little bit of extra money up front and get good nursery stock, and not just good quality nursery stock, but also if you have the option to get something that's been selected for better traits like straightness and growth, then I'd readily spend the extra $1 or $2 per seedling up front and have a much greater output of what those desired traits are decades down the road than to just get run-of-the-mill seedlings and find out that the hardwoods I plant are of crooked form, or you know, don't have other improved qualities. Right tree for the right site, that's one of the mantras of tree planting, but hardwoods tend to be a little fussier depending on the species. So if we have to be able to read the land ahead of time. Soils maps, that's a great starting point, but if you see that an area is seasonally wet, don't plant a species like black locust that can't tolerate having wet feet for maybe more than a handful of days at a time. And then, and this is really why I think mixed species hardwood planted silvopastures have a lot of advantages, is that we can again be growing at least several, if not a dozen or more species together and mixing it up, because over the past 35 years on our farm, the trees we were planting several decades ago, today many of those trees have serious pest issues like foliar fungal diseases or insects like emerald ash borer that weren't on anybody's radar at the time. So uh, first we want to make sure we're planting trees that don't have a serious known pest issue. And I struggle to think of a really a manageable pest in the forestry world. We don't just go out and spray away our problems, but it's more of an integrated pest management mentality, starting with don't plant trees that are going to crash and burn because of some well-known disease or insect pest that's out there. But looking beyond the current knowns, we have to anticipate that there's going to be more of these pests down the road. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's like, as an extension forester, I often get inquiries about, say, growing black walnut, because everybody knows black walnut's a really valuable tree, but then along comes something like the thousand canker disease or neonectria or you know the next leaf muncher that really likes walnut trees, and all that money and time you invested into growing your favorite species is kind of all for naught. And finally, uh, again, keeping in mind that hardwoods can be quite sensitive to herbaceous competition in the early stages of establishment, we want to think about like if you and I don't think, by the way, cutting corners or cost cutting with tree planting works if you're not going to do it by the book and really go all in with it. It's kind of like digging a hole and sticking your money in the ground versus thinking you're going to invest all this time and money and then someday have a great young forest to show for it. But if you feel that you're not going to be able to go out there perhaps and water trees during a period of drought stress, then don't plant a hardwood species that may be particularly sensitive to drought stress. And from that list I shared earlier, I guess all those trees, at least once they kind of get their roots in the ground, can probably tolerate drought stress. But there's here in upstate New York, maple would be a common tree that we may want to incorporate into a planting, and sugar maple just doesn't do drought and doesn't like herbaceous competition either, for that matter. Lastly, on the tree planting front, if you're thinking of planting trees to establish a silvopasture, the good news is there's a growing number of these businesses out there. John Fike mentioned some of these new companies such as Trees for Grazers. I think, well, all of them, Working Trees, Propagate, Interlace Commons. They're more over in Vermont area and a little more extensively focused on other silvopasture systems. But I find that farmers, we get that zeal for planting trees, and we order the trees, and we maybe manage to get them in the ground in a timely fashion. That's about where we run into the wall, because then we get busy with other things that have to happen on our farm, and the ongoing care of those trees can be a struggle. So I'd like to see more of these kind of full spectrum turnkey tree establishment, but tree establishment in the context of silvopasturing startups become available in across all of the eastern US. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about another type of hardwood silval pasturing when the trees are already there, whether somebody planted them once upon a time or maybe we did, and or the squirrels planted them for us, or they just came in through natural regeneration. I jokingly refer to this as the 3 easy steps of silvopasture establishment, but as you all know, it's not particularly easy, but there are essentially 3 things that have to happen to go from a stand of existing trees to uh, um, enhancing that area and creating a silvopasture out of it. So the first step is thinning. Thinning is a forestry term. I It's hard for me today to step outside my forester boots and know if thinning means the same thing, say, to uh, an Aggie as it does to a forester. Probably does, but like in the case of gardening, we don't thin our garden, we weed our garden. Same concept though, but thinning is where we reduce the competition within a group of trees to reallocate sunlight. And when we're doing this strictly for timber objectives, we're trying to reallocate the sunlight around the crowns of our best upper canopy trees. The difference between thinning for timber management versus for silvopasture management is that we have to extend that thinning all the way to the ground surface, in forestry known as thinning from below, where we start at the bottom, work our way up till we're also, and the reason we have to thin not just at the upper canopy level, but the lower strata as well, is that if we have a layer of interfering vegetation, such as invasive shrubs or a bunch of suppressed trees in beneath the upper canopy, they can be sucking up a lot of this valuable sunlight that we need to grow our forages. And Colby last week was talking about the differences between warm season and cool season forages, and caution that you probably need a little bit more solar energy reaching the ground surface if you're focusing more on the warm season forages, and overall a little less shade tolerance. Our cool season forages, by nature, they tend to do better in light shade, which is why they typically senesce during the hottest periods of the growing season or the grazing season. But many of the cool season forages that dominate our pastures in at least the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, like orchard grass, tall fescue, um, even some of the forbs, red and white clover, have at least modest shade tolerance. Depends a little bit on the variety. Those all those forages can do well in a relatively open hardwood silvopasture environment. When I have the opportunity to share about silvopasturing here in the context of our very valuable northeastern hardwood forests, I point out to the usually farmer audiences that many of the trees that grow in our farm woodlots, they're basically pulpwood or firewood quality trees, and they're trees that essentially lost the race for the sky, and they're hanging in there under they either eventually die out to competition or they just persist in that understory. And when we remove that glut of lower quality trees, usually the smaller diameter trees, but perhaps also the trees that have some obvious signs of defect, and perhaps species that are lower on our list of priority species for whatever our objectives are. When we um, remove that low grade timber though, and we look at in the landing as a standing tree, it may have looked like a nice tree to the non-forester, and then you see it in the landing in that lower right hand picture there, and you realize that a lot of those trees had a lot of hidden internal defect, and all they were going to do is become a slightly bigger piece of firewood or pulpwood over time, but it wasn't going to grow into the high value export grade hardwood saw timber that you would see in that upper left hand picture. Those logs, by the way, in that lower right hand picture came out of that same area that's in the upper left hand picture. I think I said upper right hand picture. Last week, Colby talked about using a spherical densiometer to strive to get that 50% open canopy or openness versus density of the canopy. And that's about what we're aiming for with hardwoods as well. And I know many of you on the webinar today are foresters. So how does that convert to stocking in terms of basal area per acre or relative density? Well, it doesn't translate directly, but 50% canopy closure or canopy openness would be roughly 50% relative density. It would also be approximately the B line on a mixed hardwood stocking chart. But I think stocking basal area per acre is it's a quick and easy thing to measure in the field. With a densiometer, you can measure canopy closure or openness as well. The problem with hardwoods is they lose their leaves in the winter, so you're going to get a different reading during the leaf off season as you would when things are fully foliated, or if you have a defoliation event, that's also going to give you a different reading. So but measuring basal area per acre, that's quick and easy, but it doesn't tell us the full picture, because if we're talking about species that have dense crowns, such as maples, here in the Northeast, things like hemlock, spruce, beech, that's 60 square feet of basal area per acre is different in those dense crown species than it is a kind of a porous open crown species like aspen, oak, larch. So we can't, relative density is a more useful gauge, but it's a little more arduous to calculate and manipulate during our implementation of our management. So that's about as messy as I want to get today with the discussion. It's just that for the non-foresters on the call today, please understand that it's not about just going out and cutting trees till it kind of feels good or looks about right, that there are ways that we can measure how much competition is there and how much competition we have reduced it to gauge if we're going to be getting enough sunlight moved to the soil surface to grow productive forages. And in forestry thinning, we break it into two basic categories: commercial and pre-commercial or non-commercial. Commercial, as the name implies, somebody's paying us to come in and cut the trees that we want to remove to create our silvopasture. And when we're talking about fairly large scale, fairly well stocked, fairly mature stand, it's usually going to be a commercial harvest, meaning we're going to make a net profit from it. If we're doing this on just a few acres and it's relatively small timber or pretty low value, low quality stuff that there isn't a market for, we may need to do that at a cost. I don't think of it as a cost, I think of it as an investment. And there's a variety of ways we can do that. We can be injecting trees, we can be going in and doing a mechanical thing. So we can do a chemical thing, we can do a mechanical thinning. That picture in the lower right hand corner, that's a purpose-built forestry mulching machine. in that case, it's a Fecon, but there's other brands and styles that can do the same thing. Basically, grind up a bunch of worthless or nearly worthless trees, turn them into chips, the slashes disappears, and if you look at the foreground versus the background, we've now got about that 50% sunlight versus shade ratio, whereas in the background, it's nearly 100% shade. We can grow forages now in that foreground. We can't grow forages yet in the background until we complete that thinning. One caveat about any type of thinning is think about how you can really minimize the slash. And there's a lot of creative ways I've seen people do this with our silvopasture harvest up this way. So I'm not going to get into a lengthy discussion. Maybe we can talk about more in the group discussion at the end here, but whole tree utilization would be what I'm aiming for, knowing I'm not always going to be able to get the loggers to be able to utilize the whole tree. And if not, I need to think about at least then trying to do some sort of consolidation, because if we leave as much slash on the ground as what you see there in that upper left-hand picture, it's going to be really hard to get forages established in that. But it's going to be even harder to then use the livestock to keep that in check afterwards. So to wrap up, I'd like to emphasize that silvopastures are only as good as the quality and quantity of the food available. So we've done our thinning now. We have shifted that sunlight down to where we can grow forages with it. The next easy step is that we have to get forages established. Again, a lot of creative ways I've seen this done, but depending on what we anticipate is in the soil seed bank, we may need to do some sort of supplemental seeding, like a broadcast seeding of improved forages, or if it's your typical farm woodlot that's surrounded on fields and pastures on all sides, that the seed of what would be your best forages, the most want to grow there, may already be adequate in that soil seed bank. These are pictures from a friend's farm who John used to sheep to, I call it sheeping in the seed, and then also known as hoofing in the seed. And then you can see towards the end of the first growing season the success that he had. And then finally, once things start to grow, it's going to be a mix of good stuff and not so good stuff. So we have to think about how we can skillfully and creatively use our livestock workforce to keep shifting this in an ever more desirable state or positive direction. We can be doing things like bale bombs that you're getting over 1 million pounds of density per acre. We always want to strive to use high density grazing to our advantage, but it's really hard to get ultra high density mob grazing in a silvopasture environment where there's a lot of trees and other obstacles in the way. And then we can also be thinking about the grazing behaviors of certain livestock species. And when we mix small ruminants in with our big ruminants, they kind of selectively, well, it's not that they're going to completely defoliate and kill that multiflora rose, but they're going to keep it in check. Lastly, because it always comes up in the questions, is how do you regenerate trees if you got animals in there? The foresters get this, but regeneration is an event in the life cycle of a forest. So I would argue, though, that it's not really silvopasturing if we don't have a follow-up plan to periodically establish at least patches of new cohorts of trees. And when that time comes, the fences that keep our livestock in today can keep our livestock out for a period of time. More importantly is how you're going to address the deer issue, because they'll just jump over your electrified fence and go in there and browse into oblivion all those young hardwood trees that you want to grow. But you can be doing it at an individual tree basis, you can be doing it at a patch basis or gap basis, or you can be doing it across an entire paddock in forestry known as stands. And just because I'm an extension person, I get my gold stars and smiley faces. If I mentioned something about extension, we've been compiling what we think are useful hardwood silvopasturing resources on our Cornell Cooperative Extension Forestry Extension page. It's the forestconnect.info site there at the bottom. And we also have a silvopasture forum where I try to webinar series like this or good magazine articles. We use it to archive that type of information, and you'll find other resources on there like this silvopasture management plan template or site evaluation exercise.
Thanks so much, Brett. That was always a information bomb when we
Yeah.
do these things. That was so great. We are getting your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to keep a few to save for a live discussion. But next we're happy to introduce Wynn Miller, who once again is the proprietor, manager, owner of Lick Skillet Farms, joining us from Tennessee. So please regale us with your experience and your knowledge, Wynn.
Okay, can you guys both see and hear me?
Yeah, if you could, it's not in presentation mode yet, but I can see. Oh, it is great. Perfect. You're all good.
Okay,
And I will give you a 10-minute, I'll give you the warning when it's been 10 minutes.
thank
just
you.
question.
Thank you. Well, first off, I should say I'm not an owner, I'm a daughter at Lick Skillet Farm. I run Wynn Miller Land Solutions, that's just me. I have been working on silvopasture at my family's farm in East Tennessee for several years now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about farm context, and just to kind of put you guys in a mindset. This is going to really be a shift from what Brett was talking about. And as he was talking, I was taking lots of notes because I'm not formally trained as a forester, and I don't really know that much. I wish I knew more about forestry. So what he was talking about was kind of trees had kind of a primary, they were kind of the, seemed to be a real primary focus of the work. And so I always like to start with context, because it doesn't really make sense to talk about how we approach these new practices without knowing what your context is, because that's really going to change what your solution is. So that's this. We just want to really emphasize that what you hear from me is going to differ from what you hear from Brett. And if you go, wait a second, why is she doing things so different? It's because trees aren't what make us money. Meat is what makes us money. We're a livestock farm. We're a century farm. We used to do crops, but we do only livestock now. So we manage about 1,000 acres, and most of that is cattle pasture. But we also do pork and lamb and broilers and layers. So really, I mean, the burger, I was like, burgers are our bottom line. They're what pay the bills. So trees are, a support system for our grazing animals, and in particular for our ruminants. We do direct market our stuff. Our ruminants are all grass fed. And I could speak more about any of this stuff. I'm going to kind of go through, there's a lot of slides, so I'm going to kind of go through quickly. But of course, anything that you see that you're curious about, I'm happy to talk in more about afterwards. A little bit about our environmental context, which is also really important. A lot of the case studies, it may just be that I have a chip on my shoulder as a Southerner, but a lot of the case studies and research and stuff that I see comes out of a more northern latitudes. And so I struggle to find guidance and case studies that apply to our environment. So we have a long sunny growing season, tons and tons of weed pressure, tons of rain, tons of, seed in the seed bank, very rich soils, and a lot of biodiversity. So a lot to work with, but a lot of competition also for those trees. So why did we get into silvopasture? So we do have lots of trees, but because of the legacy of haymaking, they're pretty much just on the slopes. There's not a lot of trees in pastures. So whenever that book came out, I don't know, 2010 or something, Kick the Hay Habit, my parents read that book and they really liked the sound of it, because my dad, he's not great at equipment, and our every May was just, terrible. Making hay we found it very stressful. Some people like to make hay, we don't. So as much as we could, we kicked the hay habit. And over the past 20 years, basically through managing our, stockpiling and managing our forages better, we've reduced our hay each year for 5 pails. It used to be 5 bales per animal per year, and now it's down to 1. So if you're interested in that, if you're a producer and you're not crazy about cutting hay, I recommend Kick the Hay Habit. And I know there's a lot of great extension programs that can help you with your forage management. But so now that we're no longer making hay, that kind of opens up our fields a little bit more for growing trees. And we know that especially as we've in more recent years been getting more crazy weather events, like week-long heat waves, we know that for a variety of different reasons, our animals' performance is better when they've got dispersed shade. As you can see, this is kind of a typical pasture, the way things have been. On the left and the right, there is just not a lot of trees that are well dispersed throughout our fields. So we knew we wanted more trees, and I've been trying to grow trees for a long time, and they all kind of all died as we're getting started. And now we've succeeded. And so I'm going to talk about, how much I love trees. But before I go any further, I want to kind of if there are some producers out there, or if there are some folks who are, livestock and is what really makes, is what really pays your bills. I've noticed that I think it has something to do with the fact that in the past decade or so, we've gotten so many amazing books and documentaries about the magic of trees, and how in, these old growth forests in British Columbia, these trees are they're just working magic up there. And it is true, trees are magical, but a lot of that, a lot of those complex mycorrhizal networks are, and again, I'm not a forestry person, so somebody else can, I'm sure, get in the comments and correct me and tell me how I'm wrong, and I'll absolutely listen. But my understanding is a lot of those really neat interactions are happening in a denser, older forest canopy, more closed canopy setting, as opposed to for us. So this would be a big difference between what Brett described and what we're doing. We don't want anywhere near 50% canopy closure right now, because burgers are what pay our bills. Now, if that were to change and we were to seek an additional income stream through timber, that will change. And I will hopefully address that a little bit more in the future. But right now, the animals are what we know we can sell, and the trees are just to support that. And that won't be the same for a lot of these silvopastoral systems. I'm just kind of, think of me as on one end of the spectrum, is the trees are really just there to support the cattle. So that being said, what I've noticed is that I fear that folks are starting to kind of maybe oversell the positive interactions that could happen between trees and grass. And I'll be the first to say I want our fields to look more like a savanna. I want to move in that direction. But I also think that we have to be careful that we don't overlook, if what you're starting out with is pasture and you care about your carrying capacity, taking care of your grazing management and your soil health. And that includes putting in infrastructure, making sure you're doing good rotational grazing. And if you've got a really dilapidated field, you may need to come in, do some testing, do some amendments, change your management setup. All that stuff is going to be really critical to your productivity and your profitability as a livestock farmer. And so I wouldn't just, it's kind of like if you were to add trees into that to try and support your grazing operation, that's kind of like adding turbo to an engine that was falling apart anyway. You want to make sure that you treat your ground right. And I just think that's really important, a foundation for our pasture management. And the reason that I put this photo up here on the upper right is let's see, that's annual ryegrass growing in the spring. And so it's grown, I could show that photo and go, look, grass grows under trees, but that's like in the spring. I mean, later in the year, that grass is going to be dead once that foliage comes out, and then the grass outside will be more productive. Now, what we do notice is that it seems like although we get lower biomass overall under the trees, that the digestibility of those grasses, specifically of the cool season grasses, like Brett was talking about, as it gets hotter outside in the sun, I believe that the digestibility of the grass underneath the tree is maintained for longer than out in the sun. And that's a real big difference. That's really important if you're a livestock producer, because your cattle are only going to take so many bites per day, and you want them to be getting stuff that they can actually process and use. So I do think there's a role. I just don't think that we should go, oh, trees are going to kind of miraculously fix my pasture. If you've got really crappy pasture, you're going to have to fix that first. So as we were moving into this, I always tell people I've been planting trees in cattle pasture since I was a little girl, and pretty much all of them have died. I've used every single kind of protection method out there, I believe, and none of them worked. So I'm going to show you what we finally got to that finally worked. So what I do right now is I use a 6-foot tube that I wrap with poly wire that's energized, and that goes around each individual tree. Now, again, this is what works for me. It's what's most cost effective for me. So read that, cost effective. It is more costly than other methods, but I manage my mortality better. So I've said right here, we've increased our survival 4 to 5 times. Really, in the past, on a long enough time scale, just pretty much all those trees died. We just weren't doing it right. And now, except for kind of bad weather, I have mostly, it's above 90% survival now, as long as we've got a good year. I'd say once you take in like the first 5 years of the tree, you're going to lose a few more, but definitely survival is going to be above 80%. So the way I see it is we were just doing it wrong in the past, and we found a way that worked. So I'm going to share with you guys that way that worked for us today. But again, just remember that depending on where your income is coming from, what types of trees you want to get, do you want there to be a timber income from them? Do you want them to be a non-timber income? What is your ideal canopy density at the end of your project, and why? Ours is going to be a little bit out on one end of the spectrum. So just keep that in mind. So if you can see that little red line, basically the wire goes along the top of the tube, between the tubes in rows, and then it wraps around halfway down the tube, and that's energized. And the reason it goes along the top is so you can walk or drive your ATV or the cattle walk underneath it. I'm going to run through a walkthrough.
Oh, I'm just going to say you have about 5 minutes or so, just to give you a warning.
Thank you. Okay. So I'll go through this walkthrough, and I'm going to kind of breeze through it. And then if there's anyone who's interested, you can ask questions, but also there is this link. But if you want to search for Wynn Miller Appalachian Sustainable Development on YouTube, there's a video where I go through this walkthrough in more detail. So that might help if anyone's actually wanting to see how to do this. But I'm just going to kind of fly through it, and just let me know if there's questions on any particular part.
I'll also put the link in the chat just so everyone knows, and I already added the links to the original webinar. So
awesome. Thank you. So we use this 6-foot planter system. I do not sell planter products, but I think they are amazing. I use them now even when I'm not in a field, because they're so great for the cattle. They're just, as far as tubes goes, they've just pretty much just figured it out. They grow, they basically serve as a micro greenhouse. They grow trees straight and tall. They get a longer growing period than they would outside of the tubes. And I've got little northern red oaks that were planted at the same time, and the ones in the tube, some of them are 7 feet tall now, and the ones that are not in the tube are like 3 to 3.5 feet tall. They were planted a few years back. Now the downside is, yes, they are weak wood when they get out the top, and I can address what we do if you're interested as they're growing up. I want them to grow up tall and straight, but then they have to go through a strengthening process as well, which I've kind of got like a phase 2 on. So the whole system of per tree is about $10 retail. Then I wrap this poly wire around it. Okay, like I said, this is what's most cost effective for us right now. It's not the ideal thing. Poly wire is not made to be used like this, and I would love it if we had a better solution out there on the market. Salesman, feel free to call me if you've got something that will make my job easier. But poly wire, it works. It's lighter weight, and it doesn't droop the way that metal wire does. It's just a bunch of little wires wound through with plastic. The plastic is UV rated, so it lasts a long time. And poly wire is what's made for rotational grazing. It's supposed to be kept on this spool, but what I do is I cut it up. That really increases our labor cost, but it's also very effective. So that's what, when you get at that cost effective piece, it's like, yeah, it's costly, but it's so effective. It really keeps the cattle off. So just as a quick breeze through what it looks like to set up one of these systems, you need a rigid end post. So here he's driving in a T-post. You will stretch your, what I'll call the row wire between those rigid end posts, and then connect it with an insulated, some sort of insulated connection. There's no pretty way that I know to do that. You're just kind of tied on there with some plastic. You're going to plant and prune the trees. You're going to drive the stake, slip the tube over the tree, label it if desired. One little thing for those of you out there who've ever taken a permanent marker and written on a tube to remind yourself of something and then come back in 6 months and it's disappeared, try the oil-based markers that you can get at a co-op that are for writing on ear tags. Those will last like 2 or 3 years in the sun. They're UV safe. Then you're going to add on your fastener, your wire fasteners, wrap it with poly wire. We put these little hairnets on the top. Don't skimp on those, because if you do, you'll get songbirds that fall down in there and then die. And then you're going to connect the whole thing to your row wire. That can be on the top. The planter tubes have 4 holes in them, so you could do it along the middle or along the top, either one. If you want it to work as a fence that stops the cattle, you'll want to do it along the middle. We want the cattle to be able to move underneath, so we use that top one, and the row connects along the top, and then it comes down each tube. Then you're going to energize them. There's solar and permanent options. And then you want to test them for when they're in their training periods and their first time that they've seen the tubes. I recommend a 6 to 7 kV volts. That's pretty much going to be the top of your little voltometer or whatever it's called. But once they get used to them, just like a regular electric fence, 2 to 3,000 volts is going to be enough. So I think that's what I've got right now. And there's a few other, if you wanted to, there's a few other slides I could look at it, but I'll turn it back to the group and see how I've done.
That was great, Wynn. Thank you so much. We have time for only 1 or 2 brief questions. However, Wynn and Brett will both be joining us for the final webinar, where we're inviting all of the producers to answer all the questions from the audience. Ashley, did you see any questions that kind of jump out at you that might be best to promote?
Well, I've been holding on to Brian B's question because I really do want to answer it live. Because my short answer, he asked if there's any data.
Yeah, can you repeat, say it out loud?
Yeah. Is there any data on predation for livestock in the more like wooded natural type of silvopasture systems? And the short answer from a research perspective is there are no good studies really to describe that. So this really needs to be answered by anecdotal evidence from our producers. So I wanted to make sure that Wynn and Brett have a chance to talk about it too.
In the one picture I showed, my friends flirt and bale grazing in winter silvopasture, and it's normally not the place you'd want to stick the big flock of sheep for the winter, because it's way out back and lots of places for the predators to hide. But John has done 2 creative things to really, I wouldn't say just minimize predation. He basically has no predation. One is he has electrified high tensile fence around the perimeter, which seems to be effective for keeping the coyotes and the bears out. It's not a small weave fence. It's like it's something that I saw up in Ontario, Canada. It's like a large weave, probably 12 by 18 inches, but it acts as a woven fence. And the other is he's got big animals mixed in with the small animals. So I made a comment there that I think a lot of predation issues, at least for the larger ruminants, sheep, goats, cattle, it's usually our fault that predators cause the problem. It's, I acknowledge it may be different for poultry.
I do have concerns about this. Right now, we don't have a ton of poultry predation. We have hawks all the time, but they go for doves instead of our chickens. I do think as the trees are growing up around where they are, I'm concerned about certain types of trees, especially with snags being perfect places to just encourage their aerial predators. As far as coyotes, we don't really have bears. We do have bobcats and mountain lions occasionally, but not enough to really count those mortalities. But coyotes are definitely a serious threat on our lambs. And for that, there's no way for us to be able to fence out the coyotes. You just have to have a good dog, and maybe in tandem with fence as well. But I mean, a coyote can clear an 8-foot fence anyway. We know that. So it's like, I don't know whether they're going over or under, but I mean, we just live with coyotes, so the dog is important. And then really most of our predation on our birds are actually coming from like raccoons, rats, weasels, stuff like that. So I do think there's something to be said with the sheep, but for me, the predators are going to be there anyway. So trees are not. I mean, I wouldn't want to put trees in a area that was like real, tons of scruffy and just like you're just asking for predators. But if you've got most of them, kind of limbed up in an open area, and you've got some good dogs, hopefully they can manage those predators.
Great. We are at the top of the hour, so I just want to thank our presenters for joining us, Wynn and Brett. Brett, this is your second round, and Wynn, we also appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Just want to remind everybody to, let me just pop up a couple slides, but please go to the screen with the green buttons and the orange buttons so that you can complete the webinar portal process and get to the evaluation for this webinar, as well as get your continuing education credits or any certificates that you need. And I hope you can join us again next week for the 4th webinar in this series. I will add all this. I'm in the process of adding the slides from today's webinar and the slides from last week's webinar, as well as the related links that Brett and Wynn mentioned today will be on that link. And the recording for this webinar will be available in a day or two, and previous recordings are already available. So thanks once again. And we'll also keep track of these questions that were asked that we didn't get to for the final webinar.